Madrid, summer of 1680. The air above the city rippled with heat, thick and unmoving, pressing down on the red roofs and marble courtyards of the royal palace. Inside the Alcázar, beneath painted ceilings and gold-lined corridors, a strange silence ruled, the kind that hides unease behind the perfection of ceremony. Servants whispered, courtiers turned away, and every time a young princess passed, they covered their noses not out of disrespect, but pity. The perfume of lavender and rose water could no longer mask the truth. Something was deeply wrong within Spain's royal blood. 4 generations, the Habsburgs had tried to protect their power by keeping it pure. Uncles married nieces, cousins wed cousins, and kings took brides whose faces already filled the family portraits on their walls. It was meant to preserve the crown. Instead, it preserved a curse. Beneath the lace and jewels, their children were born frail, trembling, and haunted by the weight of a decision made centuries before. And now, at the heart of this fading empire, a fragile young boy sat on the Spanish throne, Carlos II, a king in name, but in truth, a prisoner of his own bloodline. His story isn't just about a dynasty collapsing. It's a warning carved in history. What happens when human pride defies the laws of nature? This is the tale of the last Habsburg of Spain, the monarch known to history as the Bewitched King. The sun over Madrid in 1680 was merciless. It baked the red tiles of the royal Alcázar until they shimmered, filling the palace air with the smell of hot stone, candle wax, and perfume. Inside, beneath ceilings painted with angels and saints, servants fanned the corridors to keep the air from turning stagnant. But no fan, no scent of lavender or rose water, could hide what had begun to rot within the House of Habsburg, not the walls, but the blood itself. The Spanish Empire still stretched across oceans, from Mexico to Manila, yet within its heart, decay had taken root. Courtiers pretended not to notice the whispers that followed the royal family. The king's children are cursed, someone had murmured years ago. No, not cursed, just too royal for their own good. The words were half a joke, half a truth. For centuries, the Habsburgs had believed that blood was sacred, that the closer it remained to itself, the more divine their rule would appear. So, they married not for love, not even for politics, but for proximity. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew, the same eyes, the same jaw, the same names repeating through generations like an echo that refused to fade. The idea was simple, to keep the empire pure. The result was catastrophic. Nowhere was the cost more visible than in Princess Margarita Teresa. At 19, she was the jewel of Spain, daughter of King Philip IV, niece to her own mother, and symbol of royal continuity. Yet when she passed through the palace corridors, the air seemed to shift. Maids sprayed rose water in her wake, hoping to mask the odor that clung to her skin, a heavy, sour scent like mildew and decay. She was beautiful, yes, but in the way a fragile porcelain figure is beautiful, admired from afar, feared up close. Her condition was whispered about but never named aloud. Some said it was a disease of the flesh, others called it divine punishment. But to the royal physicians, it was the visible symptom of an invisible legacy, the body rebelling against the unnatural closeness of its own lineage. Don Diego Velázquez, the aging court painter, had spent decades capturing the family's likenesses. He'd painted their crowns, their brocade, their solemn eyes. But as he watched the princess glide past, he saw not majesty, he saw repetition. Each generation bore the same features carved deeper, the heavy jaw, the thick lips, the vacant stare. The faces of the Habsburgs had become a genealogy of deformity, a portrait of power collapsing inward. Velázquez remembered a conversation years before with the royal physician, Dr. Luis Mercado. Purity of blood, the doctor had said, is a myth that demands a price. In his private writings, Mercado had warned the king that such unions, uncles with nieces, cousins with cousins, were slowly poisoning the royal line. His treatise, Morbis Hereditarius, had been filed away, ignored. The king believed in divine right, not in medicine. Down in the palace kitchens, a woman named Maria stirred a steaming pot of herbs. She had served 3 generations of Habsburgs, and she knew their ailments better than the court doctors. Poor child, she muttered as she ground rosemary and thyme into a thick paste. It isn't her fault. She was born from pride, not sin, but sometimes they look the same. The door burst open. The high steward appeared, red-faced and sweating. "Hurry with that remedy," he barked. "Her Highness will soon receive the French ambassador." Maria handed him the bowl reluctantly. "You can't cover what's inside," she said softly, but he was already gone. In the grand reception hall, The courtiers stood in formation like chess pieces, each step rehearsed. The ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Torcy, entered with the calm confidence of a man who knew he was not there to pay respect, but to observe weakness. Every detail he noted would soon cross the Pyrenees and land on the desk of King Louis XIV. Every feint, every tremor, every rumor would become leverage. France was watching Spain bleed from within, and it would not waste the opportunity. When the princess appeared, the room stiffened. Beneath the lace and silk, she walked with the careful grace of someone who had practiced dignity her entire life. Yet, as she bowed to greet the ambassador, her vision blurred, her knees faltered, and she fainted. The sound of her collapse echoed through the hall like a verdict. Servants rushed forward, courtiers whispered, and somewhere in the crowd, Colbert smiled faintly. In another wing of the palace, a boy sat by a window, staring at the gardens he could never touch. Carlos, the 12-year-old prince, heir to the throne of Spain, held a book he could not read. His tongue was too large, his speech slurred, his jaw malformed. He struggled to breathe through the simplest sentences. His legs were bent from rickets, his skin pale as candle wax. Outside, children played, shouted, laughed, the kind of joy his doctors called dangerous. For Carlos, a fever could kill. "Let's try again, Your Majesty," said his tutor, voice trembling with frustration. Carlos blinked, his eyes dull and wandering. He turned a page but did not see it. His mind drifted, as it always did, to the sound of bells in the courtyard, to the dream of running barefoot, of being anything other than what he was. Meanwhile, in the council chamber, King Philip IV sat slumped beneath the weight of both empire and guilt. The Duke of Medina leaned forward. "Your Majesty," he said cautiously, "we must secure the succession. A marriage for Prince Carlos must be arranged before it's too late." Too late. The words hung in the air like a curse. Philip nodded slowly, stroking his beard. He already knew what the physicians whispered. His son might never father a child. But he would not speak it aloud. To admit it was to admit the dynasty's end. "Search the royal houses of France, Austria, Portugal," he commanded. "Bring me suitable matches." No one mentioned the truth, that no match, no alliance, no dowry could change what ran in the Habsburg veins. That evening, thunder rolled above Madrid. The storm clouds pressed low over the city, heavy and grey. In the royal library, the physician Dr. Mercado sat hunched beneath a single candle. The wax dripped down his fingers as he traced the words he had written years before. The repeated union of blood too close in kin produces fragile offspring, prone to deformity, and in the worst cases, incapable of reproduction. He closed the book and stared at the flame. He had warned them all, the kings, the ministers, the priests. None had listened. Outside, the storm broke. Rain hammered the stone courtyards, washing dust from the statues of saints and emperors. In the corridors, the scent of lavender mixed with damp air, clinging to the walls like a memory. Somewhere deep within the palace, the princess wept quietly behind a locked door. And above her, lightning flared across the painted ceiling, illuminating a family portrait of generations past. They all had the same face. The empire had conquered continents, built cathedrals, and ruled oceans, but it could not escape itself. The blood that once symbolized power had become its undoing. And as the thunder echoed across Madrid, a single truth settled over the palace like dust on an old crown. What kings had united in the name of purity, nature would soon divide in the name of consequence. The portraits hung in every hall of the Alcázar, each generation of the Habsburg dynasty staring down with the same unmistakable features, the long upper lip, the heavy jaw, the eyes that seemed both proud and exhausted. To visitors, they were symbols of continuity. To those who served the family, they were warnings carved in oil and canvas. Every brushstroke was a record of what centuries of royal purity had created. By the time Princess Margarita Teresa reached adulthood, the resemblance between the living and the painted had become unnerving. She could walk past a painting of her great-grandfather and see her own face reflected in his. The family resemblance had become a curse, nature's quiet rebellion against human arrogance. Margarita had grown up surrounded by grandeur. Her mornings began with ritual, attendants bathing her in rose water, dressing her in silks embroidered with gold thread, braiding her hair into elaborate coils heavy with pearls. Yet beneath the ritual, there was a constant hum of dread. Every gesture of the servants was tinged with restraint, every compliment sounded rehearsed. When she entered a room, people bowed lower than usual, not out of reverence but out of discomfort, a silent effort to avoid breathing too deeply. She knew what they whispered. She had overheard the maids once, their voices trembling with pity. "They say it's the blood," one had murmured. "It makes them beautiful and broken at the same time." Margarita had turned away before the tears reached her eyes. Her father, King Philip IV, did not speak of her illness. To the court, she was a symbol of the empire's endurance. To him, she was the consequence of his choices. He had married his niece, Mariana of Austria, not for love but to secure the divine bloodline, a match blessed by the church and justified by politics. It was a union of power disguised as providence. But as the years passed, Philip began to see the cost not in his treasury, but in his children. His son, Carlos, was the most painful proof. Born after decades of fragile heirs who died before reaching adulthood, Carlos was considered a miracle at birth. Bells rang across Spain, masses were held, and the court proclaimed that God had favored the House of Habsburg once more. But when the infant cried, the sound was strange, strained, weak, as if the air itself resisted leaving his lungs. As he grew, the signs multiplied. His head was too large for his thin frame, his tongue too big for speech, his body too fragile for play. Physicians filled pages with observations. The young prince suffers from convulsions, weakness of limbs, difficulty in chewing and swallowing. Each diagnosis ended the same way: "May God preserve him." By 12, he could barely read. By 15, he struggled to stand for more than an hour. The royal tutors called him the shadow of a king. The priests called him a test of faith. And his mother, Queen Mariana, called him my little miracle, though even she knew that miracles were not meant to last. In the palace courtyard, while the noble children raced on horses, Carlos watched from his window, his reflection faint against the glass. He envied their laughter, their strength, their unthinking freedom. "Why can they run, and I cannot?" he once asked his confessor. The priest hesitated before answering, "Because God has chosen another path for you, Majesty." Carlos nodded, but deep inside, he wondered if God had chosen, or if men had decided for him. The doctors tried everything. They prescribed tonics made from crushed emeralds, deer horn powder, and snake root. They ordered bloodletting to balance the humors, then fed him wine mixed with gold flakes to restore the spirit. Nothing worked. The king's private physician, Juan Bautista Juanini, began keeping a secret journal in which he abandoned the old theories. "The boy's condition," he wrote one night, "is not a test of divine will. It is the inheritance of man's folly. Each generation has folded upon itself. The blood has become too heavy with sameness. The line is dying not by sin, but by design." But to speak those words aloud was dangerous. Questioning the sanctity of royal marriage was akin to questioning God. So, Juanini kept his silence. As for Margarita, her world shrank with every year. By 19, her health had begun to fade. The fainting spells came without warning. Her skin grew pale and translucent, her hands cold even in the Andalusian heat. The court whispered that the princess was haunted, touched by spirits, anything to avoid saying the truth. Still, she carried herself with dignity. When she appeared at court, draped in jewels, she was the image of royal grace. Yet her eyes told another story, one of a girl who understood that her beauty was not her own, that it belonged to the dynasty, like the portraits on the wall. One afternoon, as Velázquez painted her final portrait, the old man paused. "Your Highness," he said gently, "do you ever grow tired of sitting so still?" She smiled faintly. "I was born to sit still," she replied. "Even when I walk, they tell me where to go." The painter's hand trembled. He had painted kings, generals, and saints, but none had ever seemed so aware of their own captivity. He realized, as he shaded the corners of her mouth, that he was not painting a princess, he was painting an elegy. That same summer, the French ambassador arrived in Madrid. Rumors of his visit swept through the court like wildfire. France, under Louis XIV, had risen to unmatched power, while Spain struggled to hold its empire together. Every gesture of diplomacy carried double meaning. When the ambassador met the princess, he bowed low, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. He saw the pallor, the trembling hands, the faint sheen of sweat under the pearls. "The jewel of Spain," he called her politely, though in his private notes, he wrote, "The House of Habsburg shows its decay upon the skin." After the audience, Margarita fainted once more. The next morning, her father received a letter from his physician. "The condition grows worse. There is no remedy the art of man can supply." The king read the words, then set the letter aflame. That night, he walked the halls alone, stopping before each portrait. The candlelight flickered across their faces, his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather, all bearing the same jaw, the same haunted eyes. It struck him that he was looking at one long face stretching through time, reshaped but never renewed. He paused before the newest portrait, his daughter, half-finished, her gaze serene and sad. He reached out to touch the paint, still wet, and whispered, "Forgive me." In that whisper, the whole tragedy of the Habsburgs lived. A family that had conquered continents, married crowns, and defied kingdoms, undone not by enemies, but by itself. Outside, the bells of Madrid tolled for evening prayer. The empire still stood, but its foundation, the blood that bound it, had already begun to crumble. And in a quiet corner of the Alcázar, the young prince coughed in his sleep, unaware that his body carried the weight of centuries, that his bones and breath were the final echoes of a dynasty that had traded its future for its name. The faces on the walls would remain. But soon, there would be no one left who looked like them. The Palace of Madrid was a world built on fragrance. Every corridor of the royal Alcázar carried its own scent, the sweetness of rose water in the queen's chambers, the citrus tang of orange blossom near the gardens, and, deep in the marble halls, the bitter smell of burning incense that masked something no perfume could conquer, the odor of decay. It began as whispers, then became ritual. Each time Princess Margarita Teresa appeared, servants hurried ahead of her, spritzing floral water into the air, as if aroma could erase truth. Courtiers dipped handkerchiefs into lavender, pressed them to their faces, and smiled through the dizziness of heat and fear. In the theatre of royal life, every act was choreographed, even the denial of nature itself. The preparations for the day's reception started before sunrise. The French ambassador, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Marquis de Torcy, was to be received that afternoon. The ambassador was no ordinary diplomat. He was the eyes and ears of Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, whose empire gleamed with confidence while Spain's light dimmed. Every twitch of the princess's hand, every cough, every hesitation would find its way into a letter bound for Versailles. In the palace kitchens, the old cook Maria stirred her pot of herbs once more. "Poor girl," she sighed. "No scent on earth can hide the smell of what they've done." She crushed rosemary and thyme with shaking hands, mixing them with vinegar and honey. The potion was meant to cleanse the air around the princess. Maria didn't believe in its power, but faith was part of survival here. She poured the mixture into a glass vial and handed it to the steward, who snatched it away with trembling urgency. Upstairs, in the dressing chambers, a swarm of ladies-in-waiting surrounded Margarita. They brushed powder on her face until it resembled marble, painted her lips with crushed carmine, and tied a pearl choker around her thin neck. The jewels sparkled under candlelight, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. She had barely slept. Her breath came in shallow waves. Each inhale brought dizziness, each exhale pain. "Breathe slowly, Your Highness," one attendant whispered. "I can't breathe slowly," Margarita replied faintly. "There's too much air, and yet not enough." Outside, the sound of carriage wheels echoed across the courtyard. The French delegation had arrived. The court stirred like a hive. Ministers adjusted their wigs, guards straightened their halberds, and musicians tuned their instruments to fill the hall with soft, ceremonial grace. The High Steward rushed through the doors, sweat darkening his collar. "Her Highness must descend now," he barked. Two maids lifted the princess's heavy gown. Another steadied her by the arm. The young woman, weighed down by golden fear, took one slow step after another toward the grand staircase. Every movement felt rehearsed, but under the layers of ceremony, her heart pounded against her ribs, a reminder that she was not marble but flesh. The grand hall shimmered with candlelight reflected on mirrors and polished armor. Courtiers lined the edges of the room like a living frame. At the far end stood the ambassador, elegant, confident, his powdered wig immaculate. When Margarita entered, every eye turned to her. For a moment, silence ruled. Then came the sound, a faint rustle of skirts, the clink of jewels, and she began her slow walk down the corridor. Her steps echoed against the marble, each one measured, deliberate, royal. The faint smell of her perfume, jasmine and amber, filled the air, colliding with the scent of incense and wax. The ambassador bowed deeply. "Your Royal Highness," he said in French-accented Spanish. "It is an honor." Margarita forced a smile, lowering her head slightly. "Spain welcomes you, monsieur." Her voice trembled, almost imperceptibly, but the ambassador noticed. He noticed everything: the pallor of her skin, the slight tremor in her hand, the way her attendants hovered too close. "You look radiant, Highness," he continued, though his eyes betrayed something else: curiosity, calculation. He was already writing his report in his mind. The conversation that followed was brief, polite exchanges about weather, art, and faith. But halfway through, the princess's gaze began to blur. The room spun. The air thickened. She felt her knees buckle, her vision darken. Someone gasped. The ambassador stepped forward, unsure whether to help. Then, silence. Margarita collapsed to the floor. The hall froze. Within seconds, attendants rushed in. "Bring water," someone shouted. "Open the windows." But the heavy curtains, drawn for formality, smothered the sunlight. The air remained stifling. Two maids fanned her frantically, another dabbed her forehead. The ambassador stood motionless, observing with cold precision. He had seen fainting fits at Versailles, but this was different. The princess did not wake quickly. Her body remained limp, fragile as glass. When she finally stirred, she whispered only one word: "Father." News traveled fast in the palace. By the time King Philip IV heard of the incident, the reception had already ended in chaos. He sat in his private chamber, the letter from his physician still unopened on the table. When the messenger arrived, breathless, the king's hand trembled as he reached for the document. "Your Majesty," the steward stammered. The princess fainted before the ambassador. "She's conscious now, but weak." Philip closed his eyes. "Send word to the doctors. And cancel tonight's council." His voice cracked on the last word. When the messenger left, the king unsealed the physician's letter. Inside, written in careful Latin, were words that offered neither comfort nor hope. The symptoms progress. Her weakness increases by the day. The cause lies in the bloodline itself. There is no cure. He stared at the ink until it blurred. For years, he had justified the marriages, to strengthen the crown, to unify Christendom, to keep Spain's glory untouched by foreign hands. But what he had preserved in name, he had destroyed in nature. His children bore the crown, but not the strength to carry it. That evening, the French ambassador's dispatch left Madrid. In it, he described the scene in measured, diplomatic language. The Princess of Spain, though graceful, shows grave signs of infirmity. Her complexion pale, her body delicate to the point of collapse. It appears the royal line suffers from a weakness no physician can disguise. The Spanish court denies it, but the evidence speaks louder than pride. Days later, in Versailles, King Louis XIV read the letter aloud to his advisers. "So," he said softly, "the blood of Habsburg runs thin." His gaze lingered on the map of Europe spread before him. Then soon, perhaps, it will run out. Back in Madrid, the royal palace stood quiet that night. Candlelight flickered against ancient tapestries, illuminating scenes of past victories: the Battle of Lepanto, the conquest of the New World, the coronation of kings. All symbols of an empire that had once seemed eternal. But in a single chamber, the air was heavy with the sound of shallow breathing. Margarita Teresa lay beneath silk sheets, her face pale as moonlight. Beside her, a servant whispered prayers. And outside her window, thunder rolled faintly over the city, as if heaven itself were mourning what Spain refused to admit. The next morning, the smell of roses lingered in the halls, stronger than ever. But beneath it, faint and unrelenting, the old scent returned, damp, metallic, human. The perfume of power could hide it for a day, a week, perhaps a year. But the truth was already in the air. No empire can mask the stench of its own decline. And inside the Alcázar, the House of Habsburg was beginning to suffocate on the very fragrance it had created. The bells of Madrid rang for celebration, but their sound carried a strange weight, half joy, half foreboding. On that cold November morning in 1679, the city gathered to witness what was meant to be a triumph of alliance and faith: the royal wedding of King Carlos II of Spain, barely 18, and Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the spirited 17-year-old niece of King Louis XIV of France. The carriages arrived in a glittering line, their wheels slicing through the wet cobblestones. The royal guard saluted, trumpets echoed off the cathedral walls, and the citizens of Madrid cheered, though even from the crowd, many whispered that the young king did not look well. They were right. Inside the cathedral of Santa Maria la Real de la Almudena, cold light streamed through stained glass, washing the marble floor in hues of blue and gold. The air was thick with incense and the metallic ring of bells. Rows of nobles stood rigidly, their eyes fixed on the altar, where Spain's future sat, pale, trembling, wrapped in silk and sanctity. Carlos, too, looked like a ghost dressed in finery. His crown seemed too heavy for his frail head. His jaw jutted awkwardly, his lips unable to close fully. He blinked often, as if the light hurt him. Each breath came shallow, each step uncertain. 2 attendants discreetly stood behind him in case he collapsed. Yet the crown rested upon his brow, and for a moment, the illusion of majesty held. At the opposite end of the aisle, Marie-Louise stood motionless, her white gown cascading like liquid light. Her face was young, delicate, and terrified. She had met her husband only days earlier, and when she first saw him, her smile had faltered. In the privacy of her chamber, she had wept, not from vanity or disobedience, but from shock. She had been told she was to wed a king. No one had told her that the king looked more like a patient. Still, duty bound her steps. As the organ began its slow hymn, she advanced toward him. The crowd watched, an empire holding its breath. When they finally met before the altar, the contrast was almost cruel. She, radiant and alive. He, pale and trembling. Cardinal Portocarrero presided, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceilings. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Carlos tried to respond, but the words stumbled in his throat. His oversized tongue made speech a struggle. Sigh, lo juro, he mumbled softly. Some pretended not to notice. Others looked away. In one of the front pews, Dona Elvira de Montemayor, a noblewoman of 70 years, leaned toward her granddaughter and whispered, "Look at his hands." The girl followed her gaze. The king's fingers quivered uncontrollably as he tried to slide the ring onto his bride's hand. "Do you think he can have children?" the girl whispered. The old woman frowned, but said nothing. The question hung in the air like incense smoke, unspoken yet omnipresent. From her seat, Queen Mother Mariana of Austria observed the ceremony with the calm of someone who had seen too much to be surprised. She had orchestrated this union herself, a desperate attempt to secure the dynasty's future. But even she, who had always believed that royal blood was sacred, felt the tremor of doubt. She knew that what coursed through her son's veins was not divine grace, but generations of genetic repetition. The French ambassador, standing discreetly near the back, recorded every detail in his mind. "The King of Spain is of weak constitution," he would later write. "His voice small, his limbs frail. It is doubtful he will ever produce an heir." When the vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, and the blessings completed, the congregation erupted in applause that sounded more like relief than joy. The newlyweds turned to face the crowd. Carlos tried to smile, but the movement looked painful. Marie-Louise curtsied gracefully, her hand still trembling in his. The procession left the cathedral and returned to the royal alcazar for the wedding feast. The carriages rolled through cheering crowds, banners waving in the chilly wind. But inside, behind drawn curtains, the king sat slumped, his breath shallow, his hands twitching. "I must rest," he whispered to his valet. His bride looked at him in silence, unsure whether to comfort or fear him. The feast was magnificent: roasted peacocks, candied fruits, mountains of marzipan, and rivers of golden wine. Foreign envoys praised Spain's hospitality. Musicians played dances from Seville and Naples, and laughter filled the hall. Yet every eye was watching the same thing: the king. Carlos barely ate. His jaw hurt when he chewed. His throat burned when he swallowed. He sipped broth while others feasted. From his seat, the Duke of Medinelli, the king's closest adviser, leaned toward the Constable of Castile. "Look at the French," he muttered. "They're already studying him like vultures over a dying beast." The constable said nothing but nodded grimly. When the final toast came, "To the glory of Spain and to the birth of future kings." A silence followed, too long to ignore. The words hung heavy with irony. As night fell, the courtiers began to whisper about the next ritual, the consummation. In royal protocol, the marriage bed was not a private matter but a political event. The newlyweds would be escorted to their chambers, where the court would await the symbolic confirmation of fertility. Behind closed doors, expectation would weigh heavier than any crown. In the nuptial chamber, servants lit candles and scattered rose petals across the bed. The air smelled of wine, musk, and anxiety. Carlos sat on the edge of the mattress, hands trembling, eyes glassy with exhaustion. The physicians had prepared another tonic, a bitter mix of herbs and minerals, meant to restore his strength. He drank it obediently, though it only made his stomach turn. Marie-Louise stood before a mirror, her reflection trembling as she removed her veil. She was a queen now, and yet she felt like an offering, a sacrifice to the politics of men. Her chief lady-in-waiting, the Duchess of Terranova, whispered gently, "Remember, Majesty, Spain's future rests on tonight." The young queen nodded, though tears pricked her eyes. In a small chapel nearby, monks knelt in prayer. "Grant our king strength, O Lord," murmured Father Mateo de Moya, "and grant our queen courage." His words echoed softly under the vaulted ceiling, but even he doubted that God would intervene. Outside, thunder rolled again over the city, the same storm that had shadowed the royal line for generations. No one recorded exactly what happened that night, only that the next morning, the palace was silent. No inspection of the nuptial sheets was made, out of respect for dignity, or perhaps mercy. Whispers began almost immediately, that the marriage had not been consummated, that the king was too weak, too frightened, or simply incapable. The court physicians were summoned, then dismissed, then summoned again. Each offered a new explanation, none convincing. But beyond the palace walls, the people of Madrid celebrated. Fireworks exploded above the rooftops, music filled the plazas, and bells rang once more. They could not see the truth hidden behind the silks and ceremonies, that Spain's grand alliance, the union meant to save an empire, had instead confirmed its quiet doom. And in the silent royal chambers of the Alcázar, a fragile king and a frightened queen sat apart in the candlelight, bound not by love or destiny, but by the echo of a single vow whispered before an altar, a vow made in faith but sealed in despair. The marriage of King Carlos II had been intended as a renewal of hope, a divine promise that the Habsburg line would live on. But as months turned to years, that hope began to fade like candle smoke in a forgotten chapel. The royal palace of Madrid filled with perfumes, prayers, and potions. Yet none could mask the truth that the kingdom's future had fallen into silence. Each morning, the king's physicians gathered in the marble corridors outside his chambers, exchanging theories in hushed Latin. "Melancholia of the humours," one said. "Weakness of spirit," said another. The older men crossed themselves, unwilling to say the forbidden words, sterilitas hereditas, hereditary barrenness. They had seen the same symptoms before in other branches of the family, but never so complete, so final. Carlos II, the most powerful man in Spain by title, spent his days like a patient, not a monarch. He was carried to councils rather than walking, his speech thick and slow, his thoughts drifting like fog. On good days, he smiled and tried to read. On bad days, he stared at his reflection as if hoping to find an answer in the mirror. "Perhaps I am bewitched," he once whispered to his confessor. "There must be some curse that binds my body." The confessor hesitated, then told him softly, "Not witchcraft, Majesty, inheritance." But superstition was easier to believe than science. Soon the royal court became a theatre of remedies. From Naples arrived an alchemist who claimed he could restore virility through the essence of powdered emerald and bat's blood. From Florence came a physician carrying glass vials of quicksilver and exotic spices. From Flanders, a Jesuit with a reliquary of saints' bones swore that a single prayer before them would open the womb of destiny. Each man was paid handsomely. Each failed. The rituals grew stranger. Carlos bathed in bull's blood to invigorate his royal seed. He drank potions of crushed pearls mixed with honey and ground deer antlers. He wore amulets under his robes, silver medallions engraved with Latin charms, tiny bones sewn into silk. The palace smelled of incense and vinegar, of herbs and burning oils. In the kitchens, servants whispered that their king was turning into a living experiment. One night, the court ordered an exorcism. It took place in secret, deep inside the royal chapel, lit only by torches. Monks in black robes circled the kneeling king, chanting psalms as the priest sprinkled holy water over him. "Evil spirits, leave the body of His Majesty," the priest cried. Carlos trembled, his face pale as wax, but said nothing. When the ritual ended, he was carried back to his bed, exhausted. No demon left that night. Only dignity. Queen Marie-Louise, young and isolated, watched her husband's decline with a mixture of fear and pity. She tried to be dutiful, smiling at feasts, speaking softly in public, but her letters to France told another story. "My husband is kind but fragile," she wrote to her aunt. "He suffers every hour. They feed him potions that make him ill. He prays, then weeps. He is like a child who knows the world is too heavy for him." Court gossip fed on her sadness. Some whispered that she was the cause of the king's weakness. Others accused her of using charms from France to suppress his strength. The confessor defended her, but rumors are stronger than truth. When Marie-Louise miscarried a pregnancy that likely never existed, The whispers became fire. "The French which cannot give Spain an heir," they hissed. The physicians replaced their tonics with alchemy. Dr. Juan Bautista Juanini, one of the few men who still dared to reason, wrote in his notes, "The king's ailment is structural, not spiritual. His blood is trapped in the pattern of his lineage. Each cousin's marriage has folded the same weakness upon itself." But when he tried to present his findings to the Queen Mother, she waved him away. "Our family is blessed by God," she said. "We do not speak of curses." By the mid-1680s, Carlos's health had worsened. His body swelled and trembled, his skin turned pale and blotched. He lost his teeth early, his hair fell out, his hearing dimmed. The court began to move around him carefully, as if the very air might shatter him. Even the servants spoke in whispers. The king's confessor continued to urge prayer. The physicians continued to order more exotic treatments. The apothecaries ran out of ingredients. Then one night, desperate beyond reason, a new ritual was devised. At dawn, in the royal baths of the Alcázar, servants poured steaming water laced with oil of rosemary, powdered quartz, and goat's blood. The king was lowered into it while monks recited Latin invocations. When he emerged, shivering, the water had turned red. "The impurities are leaving his body," one doctor proclaimed. But within hours, Carlos fainted again. The French ambassador reported to Versailles, "His Majesty's constitution is beyond recovery. The Spanish succession remains uncertain. His marriage, after 6 years, has produced no child, nor hope of one." Louis XIV smiled as he read it. Across Europe, the fate of the Spanish Empire had become a diplomatic chess game, a game everyone knew would end when the frail boy king's heart finally stopped. In Madrid, denial became the last form of faith. The royal court celebrated birthdays with banquets that the king barely attended. They staged hunting trips for him, though he could not mount a horse. When he appeared at the balcony, the people cheered, believing their monarch's silence was majesty, not weakness. But behind the closed doors of her chamber, Queen Marie-Louise prayed for escape. Her youth had withered in isolation. At 26, she looked twice her age. One winter morning in 1689, she collapsed after a meal. The court announced that her appendix had ruptured. Some said poison. Others whispered she had died of despair. Carlos did not speak for 3 days. When he finally emerged, he ordered black banners hung across Madrid. "She was my heart," he murmured, "and now I am only the crown." Months later, he married again, this time to Mariana of Neuburg, a German princess famed for her fertile lineage. Her mother had borne 23 children. The union gave the court something to cling to, but hope had long turned to ritual. In the gardens of El Buen Retiro, the royal botanist José Cua y Martinez tended his plants and wrote in his notebook, "When the same roots are crossed too often, the branches grow weaker. Nature demands difference." He did not know that his observation was truer for kings than for trees. The new queen prayed, the doctors persisted, and Carlos too waited, not for life, but for forgiveness. Sometimes he gazed at the portraits of his ancestors and whispered, "Did you know what you were doing?" There was no answer. By the late 1690s, Madrid had turned into a city of rumors. Some claimed witches had cursed the king. Others believed God himself was punishing Spain. But the truth was simpler, crueler, and older than superstition. Generations of pride had defied the laws of nature, and now nature was collecting its debt. In the final years of the century, the last alchemists left the palace. Their flasks empty, their miracles exhausted. The only remedy left was acceptance, and even that, the royal court could not swallow. When Carlos looked into his mirror for the last time, he saw not a king but an echo, the final reflection of a dynasty that had turned blood into destiny, and destiny into ruin. The empire's treasure fleet still sailed, the army still marched, but the true battle had already been lost, not on the fields of Europe, but within the veins of its last Habsburg king. By the time the century neared its end, Madrid had become a city wrapped in anxiety. The bells of the royal palace rang often, not for victory or coronation, but for prayers, masses, and funerals. Across Europe, every court whispered the same question: who would inherit the empire when the last Habsburg fell? Spain, once the master of continents, was now a patient on the edge of collapse. The streets still bustled, the flag still waved above the Alcázar, but the people knew their king was dying, and with him, the bloodline that had ruled for nearly 200 years. Inside the palace, King Carlos II lived in near isolation. The corridors that had once echoed with music and laughter now carried only the sound of coughing and footsteps on marble. The royal doctors no longer pretended to heal him. Their visits had become rituals of hope, a polite illusion of service to a monarch whose body was already surrendering. Each morning, Carla struggled to sit upright in bed as servants pulled open the heavy curtains. Sunlight spilled into the room, cruel and bright, illuminating his frailty. His hair had thinned, his skin was waxen, and his once dark eyes had turned cloudy. He could no longer ride, hunt, or even attend mass without collapsing. Yet despite everything, he refused to give up the crown. "I was born to reign," he told his confessor once. "If I die, Spain dies with me." But the empire was already splitting apart. The king's second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, moved through the palace like a restless spirit. Beautiful and ambitious, she had arrived from Germany with her own entourage and her own agenda. Her family had promised fertility, her mother had birthed 23 children, yet after years of marriage, her womb remained as empty as the throne's future. Desperate to maintain influence, Queen Mariana filled the court with German advisors and priests loyal to her homeland. This infuriated the Spanish nobles, who saw foreign hands reaching for the keys of empire. Rumors spread that the Queen plotted to pass the crown to her own Austrian relatives, bypassing France entirely. Meanwhile, the French ambassador reported tirelessly to Versailles. King Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, read each dispatch with predatory calm. "The King of Spain is a shadow," one letter said. "He grows weaker by the week. The physicians speak of water in the brain. His speech falters. He drifts between prayer and delirium." Louis XIV smiled slightly. For decades, France had watched the Habsburg line with envy, its wealth, its colonies, its legend. Now, nature itself was doing what armies could not. At the same time, the Austrian Habsburgs, cousins to Spain's branch, sent their own envoys, urging that the succession pass back to Vienna. Better to keep the blood pure, they argued, than let it fall into Bourbon hands. The Spanish council divided into factions. Ministers aligned with Austria or France, priests took sides, and the royal court turned into a chessboard where each move was whispered behind closed doors. The dying king became the pawn of empires. One evening, while thunder rolled above Madrid, the council gathered in the Hall of Mirrors, a room whose walls reflected the light of 100 candles. The Duke of Medinaceli, Spain's prime minister, stood at the center, his face pale with fatigue. "Your Majesty," he began cautiously, "we must discuss the matter of succession. The time has come." Carlos nodded faintly, his head drooping. "I have no son," he murmured. "No heir." The Duke hesitated. "Then perhaps your Majesty might name one." "There are candidates." "France or Austria," whispered the king. "Always France or Austria." A silence followed. Outside, the rain struck the windows like tears. Mariana entered the chamber then, her gown trailing across the marble floor. "Majesty," she said sweetly, "your duty is to God and Spain, not to foreign ambitions." But the Duke interrupted, bowing low. "If your Majesty chooses the Austrian line, France will not sit idle. And if he chooses the French, Austria will not forgive. Either path leads to war." Carlos looked from one face to another, his gaze unfocused. The candles trembled in the draught. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "war is God's punishment for what we have done." The council bowed in silence. After that night, the king's health declined rapidly. He suffered seizures, fainting fits, and periods of confusion. Sometimes he mistook his attendants for ghosts. Other times, he spoke to portraits of his ancestors as though they stood before him. "Father," he whispered once to the painting of Philip IV, "why did you marry your niece?" He stared at the painted eyes until he wept. By 1699, the end was clear. The court physicians, now little more than historians of his suffering, noted in their journals extreme cachexia, tremors of the limbs, cognitive decay, renal weakness, near blindness. In truth, the king's body was collapsing from within, every organ failing in quiet rebellion. Yet he clung to his faith. He prayed for a miracle, for strength, for forgiveness. "If I cannot leave an heir," he told his confessor, "then let me leave peace." But peace was already impossible. In the winter of 1700, Spain froze under sheets of rain and wind. Inside the palace, the king lay dying, surrounded by priests chanting in Latin. His breath came in shallow gasps. The queen stood at his bedside, her eyes hollow, her fingers clutching a rosary that trembled in her hands. A messenger arrived from France with one final letter from Versailles, a plea from Louis XIV urging the dying monarch to name a Bourbon heir, his own grandson, Philip of Anjou. "Let our families unite," the letter read, "and the blood of kings shall live on." From Vienna came another message, carried by the Austrian envoy. The Emperor Leopold demanded that Spain's throne pass to the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, to preserve what he called the purity of heritage. Carlos listened, silent. At last, he said, "If the blood is so pure, why has it killed us?" He called for his confessor, and before dawn, he signed his will. The seal of Spain pressed into red wax with trembling hands. The document named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as his successor, a decision that would ignite one of the most devastating wars in European history, the War of the Spanish Succession. When the courtiers left, only the priests remained. Carlos whispered one final prayer, "Lord, forgive the sins of my fathers, for they knew not the cost." He died on November 1st, 1700, the Feast of All Saints. The next morning, as the bells of Madrid tolled, the people gathered outside the palace. The empire mourned, though many already knew what would follow. France rejoiced, Austria raged, and the map of Europe began to shift. In the silence of his bedchamber, the last Habsburg lay surrounded by relics, amulets, and crucifixes, the symbols of faith and fear that had governed his life. Outside, a storm cleared, revealing a pale winter sky over Madrid. For the first time in centuries, Spain had a king who did not bear the Habsburg name. And for the first time, the blood of two great dynasties would collide, not in marriage, but in war. The Age of Thrones had ended. The Age of Shadows had begun. The bells of Madrid tolled low and heavy on the morning of November 1st, 1700. Clouds hung over the city like damp curtains, and the streets outside the Alcázar were lined with citizens praying in silence. They knew the truth before it was announced. King Carlos II, the last Habsburg of Spain, had drawn his final breath. Inside the palace, the air was thick with candle smoke and whispered prayers. The room smelled of wax, incense, and the faint trace of medicine. On the king's bed lay a man who no longer resembled a ruler, his face sunken, lips pale, eyes closed in surrender. The priests had already covered him with a velvet cloth bearing the royal crest. By his side, Queen Mariana of Neuburg knelt in silence. Her fingers clutched the rosary so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had come to Spain as a symbol of renewal, but she now realized she would leave as the widow of an era. Behind her, courtiers whispered like ghosts. Some murmured prayers, others calculated the future. The king's body was still warm when the palace council convened in the Hall of Mirrors. The Duke of Medinaceli presided, his face drawn and weary. Around him stood ministers, priests, ambassadors, all aware that what happened in the next few hours would decide the fate of Europe. On the polished table lay the king-sealed will, bound in black ribbon and pressed with the royal wax seal. The notary's hands trembled as he reached for it. "By order of His Majesty," he began, his voice echoing in the chamber, "the final testament of Carlos, King of Spain, shall now be read." The sound of the breaking seal cut through the silence like a knife. Every face turned toward the parchment as the notary unrolled it slowly. The script, delicate and wavering, bore the unmistakable hand of the dying king. "By the grace of God and by the right of my ancestors," the will began, "I, Carlos, King of Spain, desiring the unity of my realms and the peace of Christendom, declare my successor to be Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of His Most Christian Majesty, King Louis XIV of France." The words hung in the air like thunder. A gasp rippled through the room. The French ambassador's eyes lit with triumph, while the Austrian envoy turned ashen. The priests crossed themselves, some in awe, some in dread. The Duke of Medinaceli whispered, "God help us all." From that moment, the War of the Spanish Succession was inevitable. The will continued, its tone weary but resolute. "Should my chosen heir refuse the throne, or die without issue, the crown shall pass to the Archduke Charles of Austria. But it is my wish that peace be preserved between our realms, and that Spain remain undivided." The notary paused. No one spoke. Outside, the bells began to toll again. At Versailles, the news arrived days later. Louis XIV, the Sun King, read the document in the Hall of Mirrors before his court. A slow smile spread across his face. "The Pyrenees no longer exist," he declared. The courtiers erupted in applause. To France, it was destiny fulfilled, the bloodlines of Bourbon and Habsburg united in one crown. But to the rest of Europe, it was a declaration of war. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold I received the news with fury. He names a Bourbon, the emperor thundered. He betrays his own house. Austria, the elder branch of the Habsburgs, refused to accept it. The English and Dutch joined them, fearing that France would now dominate the continent. Within months, alliances formed, armies gathered, and the storm that Carlos had feared in his final hours began to break. Back in Spain, the Alcázar became a mausoleum. The king's body was laid in state beneath golden draperies. Nobles, priests, and peasants alike filed past to pay their respects. His face, waxen and still, looked almost peaceful, as if the weight of generations had finally lifted. Outside, rain fell over Madrid. The people whispered that the heavens themselves mourned the fall of their dynasty. He was the last of the true kings, an old woman said, clutching her shawl. After him, the blood is foreign. In the royal chapel, a funeral mass began. The choir's voices rose like wings in the vaulted ceiling, chanting for the soul of a man whose life had been both crown and curse. The Archbishop of Toledo stepped forward and spoke solemnly, "Let us pray for His Majesty Carlos, who bore the burdens of empire and the trials of the flesh, and who, in his final hour, sought peace for Spain." Among the mourners stood the French ambassador, holding the king's sealed testament, proof that his master's grandson would inherit the throne. His expression was calm, but his eyes gleamed with calculation. Spain's tragedy had become France's triumph. As the candles burned low, a faint draught stirred the velvet curtains. For a moment, those near the coffin swore they smelled lavender, the same scent that had followed the Habsburgs for generations, from Princess Margarita's fainting halls to Carlos's deathbed. It was the scent of memory, of decline, of a bloodline finally extinguished. A few days later, Philip of Anjou, barely 17 years old, arrived at Versailles to receive his grandfather's blessing. Louis XIV placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Be a good Spaniard, but remember you are a Bourbon." The room erupted in applause. The young prince's face flushed, a mixture of pride and fear. He was about to inherit not just a kingdom, but the ghosts of an empire. When Philip entered Madrid months later, crowds filled the streets once more, cheering the new monarch. "Long live Felipe V," they cried. He waved politely, unaware that his arrival marked the start of one of the bloodiest wars Europe would ever see. Behind the cheers, Spanish nobles watched in silence, their faces shadowed by doubt. In Vienna, Austrian troops marched. In London, Parliament voted for war. Across the Pyrenees, France celebrated. The world that Carlos II had left behind was splintering, not by swords yet, but by paper, ink, and ambition. In the royal library of the Alcázar, an old physician, Juan de Cabriada, who had once studied the king's illnesses, sat alone by candlelight. He opened his worn notebook, filled with sketches of anatomy and notes on bloodlines. At the final page, he wrote a single sentence. The end of a dynasty is not a moment, but a process, one written first in the flesh, then in history. He closed the book and blew out the candle. The palace lay silent. In the distant halls, the portraits of generations past stared down from their gilded frames, the proud faces of emperors, queens, and soldiers who had once ruled half the world. Now their empire existed only in echoes. The lavender scent lingered in the air, faint but unyielding, like the memory of power itself. And somewhere deep beneath the stone floors of the Escorial, the crypt awaited another king. The last Habsburg of Spain had been laid to rest. His will had lit the fuse of a war that would reshape the world. And so ended the story of blood made sacred, the dynasty that had tried to preserve itself from time, only to be destroyed by the very purity it worshipped. The throne was not empty anymore, but the blood that sat upon it was no longer the same. The funeral procession of King Carlos II began before dawn, beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver. The streets of Madrid, slick from a night of cold rain, shimmered faintly as thousands of candles flickered in the mist. Bells tolled in slow, uneven rhythm, not the proud sound of royal triumph, but the weary chime of an empire acknowledging its own mortality. From the palace to the monastery of El Escorial, the cortege moved like a shadow through the capital. Soldiers lined the streets, their halberds glinting in the dim light. Behind them, peasants knelt in silence, their heads bowed under black veils. The coffin, draped in crimson velvet and bearing the golden double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, was carried on a gilded carriage drawn by 6 black horses. Around it, monks chanted psalms that echoed against the stone facades. Requiem aeternam dona Domine. Give him eternal rest, O Lord. Yet as the procession wound through the city, People whispered prayers not only for the king's soul but for Spain itself. For everyone knew, this was not the burial of a man, but the funeral of a dynasty. Inside the carriage, sealed beneath layers of silk and metal, lay what remained of the last Habsburg of Spain. Those who had seen him at the end claimed his body bore the signs of a curse: limbs twisted, skin mottled, jaw clenched in unnatural tension. His physicians had called it disease. The priests had called it divine justice. The people called it the price of royal blood. At the front of the procession rode the Duke of Medinaceli, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He had served 3 kings and had seen Spain's glory dim with each generation. Now he led the march in silence, his horses' hooves striking softly on the wet cobblestones. Behind him came Queen Mariana, pale and rigid, her hands folded on her lap as her carriage creaked through the fog. She had prayed for an heir, for renewal, but God had given her only history. When the cortege reached El Escorial, the great granite monastery rose from the mist like a tomb built for the world itself. Its vast courtyards were filled with smoke from torches and the scent of rain-soaked earth. As the coffin was carried through the gates, the monks' chants grew louder, echoing through the vaulted corridors where the bones of kings lay sleeping. In the pantheon of the kings, deep below ground, candles cast trembling light across marble tombs engraved with names that had once ruled half the world: Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV. And now there would be one more, Carlos II, El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The final prayers were spoken by the Archbishop of Toledo. His voice trembled as he read from the book of Ecclesiastes: Vanitas vanitatum, omnia vanitas. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. When the lid of the coffin was lowered into its resting place, the echo of stone against stone rang through the chamber like a judgment. Above ground, life went on, or tried to. Only days after the burial, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted like thunder. Across Europe, drums beat, horses were saddled, and cannons rolled into fields that had once been vineyards. France and its allies proclaimed Philip of Anjou as King Felipe V of Spain, while Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic swore to prevent a Bourbon Empire from rising. In Madrid, new banners flooded, the Bourbon lilies of France replacing the Habsburg eagles. The young king arrived to cheering crowds, his face fresh, his energy unbroken. "Viva Felipe!" the people cried. After years of sickness and silence, Spain craved life again, even if it came from foreign blood. But behind the celebrations, the old palace remained haunted. In the evenings, servants whispered that the air in the Alcázar still carried the faint scent of lavender, the same fragrance that had followed Princess Margarita, King Philip, and Carlos II. It lingered in the corridors where portraits watched from the walls, where the candles never seemed to burn clean. Some swore that on certain nights, the wind carried the faint sound of coughing, or the rustle of silk gowns in empty rooms. "Do not speak of ghosts," one steward warned his staff. "It is only history, refusing to be forgotten." Far from Madrid, on the battlefields of Blenheim, Ramillies, and Almansa, the new century began in fire and blood. Soldiers fought under flags that bore names older than themselves: Austria, France, Spain, each claiming the divine right to rule a world already weary of kings. For every victory, there was a ruin; for every alliance, a betrayal. And through it all, the ghost of the Habsburgs seemed to hover, as if watching the nations fight over what their blood had left behind. Back in El Escorial, where the silence was deeper than prayer, the royal crypt stood sealed. In the stillness of that tomb, beneath marble and iron, the remains of Carlos II rested among his ancestors, not as a king, but as a lesson. Centuries later, when scientists opened the burial records and studied his lineage, they found the truth written not in ink but in genes. His parents had been uncle and niece, their grandparents, cousins. The generations before them had repeated the same unions until their bloodline had folded in on itself. His jaw, his infertility, his seizures, all had been written in the mathematics of inheritance. But for the people of his time, such explanations did not exist. They saw only divine retribution, the fall of a house that had defied nature too long. And so, the legend of Carlos II El Hechizado endured, the bewitched king who had inherited not power, but the accumulated sins of his ancestors. He became a figure of fascination, the monarch who ended a dynasty by living out its curse. In paintings and chronicles, his image survived: the hollow eyes, the drooping jaw, the fragile frame. Yet in that weakness, there was something almost sacred. He had not been cruel or proud, only human, the final victim of a system that believed itself above humanity. As the 18th century dawned, Spain rebuilt itself under Bourbon rule. The language of the court changed, the faces and portraits changed, but the memory of the Habsburgs remained, heavy as the scent of incense in an old cathedral. Their empire had spanned oceans and centuries, yet in the end, it had been undone not by rebellion or invasion, but by its own reflection, a dynasty that loved itself too deeply to survive. In the quiet halls of El Escorial, visitors still pause before the marble tomb marked with the name Korolv's Tu Rex Hispaniae. Few linger long. The air there feels colder than the rest of the monastery, as if even time itself hesitates to enter. And if one listens closely, through the echo of footsteps and the hum of silence, one might imagine the faintest whisper, not of ghosts, but of history itself. Power is not eternal. Blood is not pure. And every crown, no matter how bright, must one day turn to dust. Above the tomb, a single candle flickers, its flame wavering in the still air. The dynasty is gone. The empire is fading. But the story, the warning, endures. For as long as the wind carries the scent of lavender through the halls of Spain, the name of Carlos II will remain, the king who ended an empire by being born of it. Centuries passed. The great bells of El Escorial still tolled every November in memory of Spain's kings, but few remembered the face of the one who ended the line. His portrait hung in the royal gallery, a pale young man with hollow eyes, his lips slightly parted, his chin drooping in the unmistakable Habsburg way. Tourists walked by without stopping. Only scholars lingered. Yet behind that silent image lay a story that refused to die. The legend of Carlos II el Hechizado, the bewitched king, lived on in whispers, in textbooks, in the melancholy of Spanish history. Some called him cursed. Others pitied him. But for those who studied him closely, he represented something deeper, the final proof that power, when hoarded too long within blood and pride, devours itself. By the 18th century, Spain was reborn under the Bourbons, sleek and confident, eager to erase the memory of the decaying dynasty that had preceded them. The new court in Madrid favored the elegance of Versailles over the severity of Vienna. The palaces were brighter, the fashion lighter, the tone more French than ever before. But in the shadows of those shining halls, the ghost of the Habsburgs lingered. Some courtiers still swore that the old royal Alcázar, though rebuilt, carried a strange coldness at night, a draught that smelled faintly of lavender and candle smoke, like the scent that had haunted the reign of Carlos II. Even the maids avoided certain corridors, whispering that the king's footsteps could still be heard, slow and dragging, as if he wandered eternally between prayer and punishment. The Bourbon kings rarely mentioned him. To them, Carlos was an embarrassing memory, a monarch of weakness and superstition, a warning of what happens when faith replaces governance and blood replaces merit. Yet historians began to look closer. Documents from the royal archives revealed the scale of the tragedy. Marriage contracts that joined uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, generation after generation. Family trees that spiraled inward like a labyrinth with no exit. Genetic maps that, centuries later, would confirm what the doctors of the time could only suspect, that Carlos II had inherited a double burden, the haemophilia of his ancestors and the degenerative mutations of his line. Modern scientists would call it the Habsburg syndrome, the visible collapse of a dynasty under the weight of its own isolation. But for Spain, it had been more than biology. It was fate. Carlos's death had unleashed one of the longest wars in European memory. The War of the Spanish Succession tore the continent apart for more than a decade, from the Netherlands to the Mediterranean. When it ended, Spain was no longer the mighty empire that had once conquered the seas. Its global dominance had crumbled. Its colonies, though vast, were slipping from control. The country survived, but smaller, quieter, humbled. And yet, there was something almost poetic in that fall. For centuries, Spain had believed itself chosen by God, a nation of divine kings, unbroken bloodlines, holy conquest. The death of the last Habsburg shattered that illusion. In his frailty, Carlos II had exposed the truth. No empire, no matter how glorious, can defy nature. In the centuries that followed, artists and philosophers found in his story a mirror for their own times. The poet José de Espronceda called him the ghost of an empire that refused to wake. The historian Modesto Lafuente wrote that in Carlos's suffering, one finds not weakness but the weight of 1,000 crowns pressing upon one fragile skull. Painters reimagined his image, not as a cursed fool, but as a tragic figure, pale against the gold of his lineage. In one famous 19th century engraving, he is shown alone in his vast throne room, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors, their eyes burning like silent judges. His crown lies on the floor beside him, cracked in two. Even the 20th century could not escape his shadow. Geneticists studied his lineage to understand how power had shaped biology. Historians revisited his correspondence, uncovering moments of humanity amid the ritual and horror, a letter to his confessor confessing his loneliness, a note to the Queen thanking her for her patience with a husband who cannot be the man he wishes to be. In those few surviving words, the king's voice feels heartbreakingly real, no longer the grotesque symbol of decline, but a man imprisoned by his birthright. By the 21st century, Carlos II had transformed in the public imagination from an object of ridicule to a subject of empathy. Documentaries, novels, and films rediscovered his story. Historians describe him as the first tragic king of modern Europe, a monarch who embodied the fatal intersection of faith, science, and human arrogance. His tomb in El Escorial became a place not of royal worship, but of quiet reflection. Visitors who descended into the marble crypt found themselves standing among centuries of kings, the pillars of an empire, and at the far end, a single plaque bearing the name Carolus II, Rex Hispaniae. It was smaller than the others, more restrained, as if even death had humbled him. When the light from a visitor's lantern flickered across the tomb, one could almost imagine the faint glimmer of gold paint beneath the dust, the remnant of a dynasty's final shine. Some historians argued that Carlos II's legacy was not merely genetic or political, but symbolic, a warning carved into the marble of history. His story, they said, was the story of humanity's oldest temptation, the desire to preserve power at any cost, even at the expense of the future. For centuries, rulers had married for alliance, conquered for legacy, and prayed for purity. But in the end, the Habsburgs had proved that purity, taken too far, becomes decay. And yet, there was still something strangely noble about Carlos's final act, his will. In naming Philip of Anjou as his heir, he had chosen to end his own bloodline to save his kingdom. He had accepted extinction in exchange for continuity. That decision, historians now admit, might have saved Spain itself. Perhaps he understood more than we think, one scholar wrote. Perhaps in his silence, in his illness, in his strange resignation, there was wisdom, the wisdom of one who has seen the limits of kingship. At sunset, El Escorial turns to gold. The granite of its walls glows warm, and the mountains behind it catch the last light of the day. The monks walk the cloisters, their chants rising softly in the wind. And somewhere beneath their feet, the last Habsburg sleeps, no longer cursed, no longer pitted, but remembered. In that silence lies the echo of an empire's fall and the quiet endurance of its lesson. For kingdoms rise and crumble, crowns pass and fade, but the story of Carlos II of Spain remains, the story of a man born to rule the world, and instead, forced to teach it humility. His face still gazes from the canvas, fragile yet defiant, as if to whisper across time. The throne is temporary. The blood, too. Only the consequence endures. The monastery of El Escorial stands silent beneath the Castilian sky, a monument of granite and shadow, where history breathes in whispers. Here, among the tombs of kings, the story of Spain's Habsburgs ends not with trumpets or glory, but with the hush of inevitability. Centuries have passed, yet the cold corridors still seem to remember the echo of prayers for a dying empire. Visitors walk slowly through the crypt, their footsteps soft on the marble. Some glance at the golden plaques, Philip II, Philip III, Philip IV, names carved into eternity. But when they reach the smaller, simpler inscription, Carolus II, Rex Hispaniae, they pause. There is no grandeur, no ornament, only silence, as if even the stone understands that this name marks both the end of a dynasty and the beginning of its legend. Outside, the sun sets over the Sierra de Guadarrama. The granite walls glow faintly gold, then sink into shadow. The air is still. Yet in that stillness, the weight of history feels alive. For 400 years, Spain has carried the memory of the man who was both king and curse, Carlos II, El Hechizado. His reign is remembered not for conquests or glory, but for collapse. And yet, in that collapse lies one of history's most human truths, that power, when worshipped as divinity, can only end in dust. Modern scholars still argue over the meaning of Carlos's life. Was he a victim of genetics, a saintly fool, or the living symbol of divine punishment? To understand him is to look beyond the grotesque portraits, the elongated jaw, the lifeless eyes, and into the paradox of his existence, a man born to rule the greatest empire on earth, yet powerless even over his own body. In the archives of Simancas, historians found his letters, shaky handwriting on yellowed parchment. One reads, "I do not understand why God keeps me here. I have done nothing but pray and suffer. If I am king, it must be to learn humility. That single line captures what centuries of political writing could not. Beneath the superstition and the sickness, there was consciousness, the fragile awareness of a man who knew he was the final link in a broken chain. The Habsburgs had ruled Spain for nearly 2 centuries. They had built cathedrals, conquered oceans, and declared themselves defenders of the faith. Their banners had flown across the Americas and the Philippines. Their gold had built palaces from Seville to Vienna. But the same isolation that made them divine also made them doomed. The price of their purity was sterility, the price of their faith, blindness to nature. And so, the crown passed from uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, until one child was born carrying the weight of every error before him. Carlos II's life was the consequence of centuries of success, proof that even divine right cannot outlive human biology. His body became the battlefield where politics and pride collided with science and fate. Today, the story of Carlos II has taken on new meaning. Geneticists study his family tree as a case study in hereditary decline. Historians teach his reign as the turning point when Europe's age of faith collided with the dawn of reason. Artists paint him not as a monster, but as a martyr of inheritance, the last innocent of a corrupted legacy. In Madrid, the Prado Museum displays his portrait by Claudio Coelho. Crowds gather before it in uneasy fascination. The boy king's pale face stares back across centuries, his lips slightly parted, his gaze distant. Behind him, the painter has softened the shadows, as if to grant him the dignity that history never did. Children on school trips point and whisper. Tour guides explain the curse of the Habsburgs, the inbreeding, the ghost stories. But those who linger longer see something else, not curse, not madness, but sorrow. The sorrow of someone who was never free to be human. In the 21st century, the world that once worshipped bloodlines now prizes diversity. Royalty still exists, but the myth of divine blood has faded. And yet, the lesson of Carlos II remains startlingly relevant. Every empire, every system of power built on its own perfection, risks the same fate, implosion. Whether in kingdoms, corporations, or nations, history repeats its warning. When pride isolates, decay begins. Spain, reborn many times since his death, has learned to live with its ghosts. The Bourbon kings who followed built opera houses, universities, and enlightened reforms. They modernized a country that had once closed its eyes to the future. But none could erase the shadow of the last Habsburg. Even today, the Spanish crown bears a trace of his legacy, a humility inherited not through blood, but through memory. In the quiet town below El Escorial, old monks still tell visitors the legend of the night the king died. They say that as the clock struck midnight, a cold wind swept through the corridors, extinguishing every candle but one, the one beside the crucifix at his bedside. That single flame, they say, burned until dawn, long after his final breath. To the monks, it was a sign that God had not forsaken him. To historians, it was coincidence. But to storytellers, it became symbol, the last light of a dying empire refusing to go out. One evening, centuries later, a historian stood in that same crypt, lantern in hand. The air was cool, the silence absolute. He looked at the tomb of Carlos II and felt something stir, not fear, but awe. Here lay a king who had ruled an empire of continents, who had been both a child and a monarch, both a symbol and a warning. Around him slept the ancestors who had made him what he was, the architects of his glory and the engineers of his doom. The historian reached out and touched the cold marble. "You ended it," he whispered softly. "And by ending it, you saved it." Perhaps that was true. Carlos II's final act, choosing Philip of Anjou as his heir, had ensured that Spain would continue, though the Habsburgs would not. In choosing extinction, he had preserved the nation. Above the monastery, night deepened. The stars spread over the mountains like spilled silver. A cold wind moved through the trees, carrying faint echoes, the bells of Madrid, the chants of monks, the sound of a dying dynasty fading into legend. And somewhere, in that wind, one might imagine the voice of the bewitched king himself, speaking not as a monarch, but as a man finally free of the crown that had crushed him. "I was born to wear gold, and I found only dust. But in the dust, I found truth." The lantern light flickered out. The crypt fell silent once more. Only the marble remained, and the story of a crown that turned to ash, a legacy that became a lesson, and a man whose weakness became the mirror of an empire. Because in the end, Carlos II of Spain did what no conqueror could. He taught history to remember that even the mightiest throne must someday bow to the limits of flesh and time.